Welcome to W Report. This is an analytical transformation of an interview. In your view, what is the core problem of Europe's current foreign policy? Where is it most vulnerable in today's changing world order?
I think the weaknesses are both conceptual and organizational. The conceptual weakness is that all of Europe's foreign policy right now seems to be organized around Russophobia, a fear of Russia. I argue a completely inordinate fear of Russia, a very tendentious reading of events, both the current and past, a claim that Russia is out to get us, and this is the only response we can have is to duck under the U.S. security umbrella. We must be subservient to the U.S. because that's our only security interest. There are other elements of European foreign policy as well, and a Sinophobia, an anti-China sentiment, which is even less understandable, except that it is a feature of U.S. policy to which Europe has increasingly subscribed. So that's the conceptual idea that Europe's security is at dire risk of an invasion from Russia. And all emergency steps must be made. We must support Ukraine to fight on the front line against Russia, lest Russia show up in Paris or Berlin or even London sometime soon. Second, we must bolster NATO. Our alliance with the United States is above everything else, even though the U.S. is threatening Europe directly and not incidentally to take over Greenland. It's threatening Europe in trade policy. It is forcing very unequal and harmful economic arrangements with Europe. We must be subservient to the United States. We must militarize dramatically and rapidly, the famous 5% of GDP militarization. Now leaders in Britain, France, Germany saying we will have to give up parts of our social welfare systems because we must remilitarize. So the guns versus butter debate is going towards guns. All of that is the conceptual side. The organizational side is Europe is a mess in terms of the old question, who speaks for Europe? Kissinger famously said if he had to make a call to Europe, an urgent foreign policy call, who do you call? You have the Commission, you have the European Council, the heads of state, you have the cacophony of voices across Europe with internal debates. You have the High Representative, Vice President Kaja Kallas, who is the ultimate Russophobe, I must say. Estonia is the quintessential Russophobic country, and she's the quintessential Russophobic spokesperson for Europe. Does she speak for Europe? Well, sometimes she's at the meeting, sometimes she's not even at the key foreign policy meeting. So there's an institutional issue. Of course, behind the institutional issue is a very significant issue. Is there really a union in terms of foreign policy? What is the relationship of the European Union, which is mostly an economic, social, legal, political institution, and NATO, which is a U.S.-led military alliance? The relationship is completely blurred, I would say, and in fact, in some sense, even now legally merged, which is one of the great confusions. Europe has said, well, we're just Europe. We wanted Ukraine to be a member of the EU, but the EU and NATO are locked at the hip by many specific provisions of both NATO and the EU. And, of course, the expansion of the EU eastward went almost in lockstep with the expansion of NATO. Also, Europe has rejected the idea of neutrality, which was a long-standing and quite venerated and highly successful geopolitical institution of Europe. The idea that states could be neutral and that neutrality would be respected even in world wars, actually, but much more easily during periods simply of geopolitical tension. But that has been abandoned as well by Sweden, by Finland, and even debates of Switzerland abandoning its centuries-long neutrality. All in all, European foreign policy is, in my view, in a shambles right now. And perhaps most of all, Europe doesn't speak on the world stage. It runs to Washington. It hides behind the U.S. It calls the President of the United States daddy. That is the head of NATO, something inexplicable and worse than a comic book, but quite real, actually. Not unreal, something we actually saw. So in this sense, Europe needs a new foreign policy, you could argue, because it doesn't have a foreign policy right now. It has a massive confusion, extraordinarily weak insight into its own situation, desperately unpopular political leaders, all of whom come into office and then plummet at the polls if they follow this Russophobic line. And that's where we are, Glenn. So that's the basis of this article, that from a conceptual and institutional point of view, Europe is in a desperately poor geopolitical situation, despite being 450 million people in the European Union alone, in an extraordinarily rich part of the world. But there's no foreign policy that reflects that level of well-being, prosperity, technology, size. So time for a new foreign policy.
Sachs says Europe has no real foreign policy, just chaos, Russophobia, and blind loyalty to the U.S. The continent is weakened, divided, and lacks strategic autonomy. A new independent policy is urgently needed. You've met some of these European leaders. Do you think they truly understand that Russia's core concern is NATO expansion? Or do they genuinely believe Russia wants to invade all of Europe?
Well, this is really a good question. The narrative is so tendentious, so comic book in character, so one-sided, that every single event is read as Russia is evil, we are good, Russia is expansionist, territorial, Russia has no security concerns other than to invade us. And this is the actual line that you hear from these leaders. And part of my article is to discuss the history, the actual history, not the tendentious history, even going back to before World War II. Almost every phase of modern history is interpreted in a completely one-sided and false historical manner. For example, and I can take some obviously controversial moments, but the treaty between Hitler's Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union in 1939 that divided Poland, the Molotov-Ribbentrop agreement. This is taken as face value proof that you see the Soviet Union was perfidious and they divided Poland, and that started World War II. The story is completely different and far more interesting, which is that Stalin tried for many years to reach out to Britain and to France to make an alliance against Nazi expansion. And he was rebuffed constantly by the Western powers. So it wasn't that the West was so desperate to fight Hitler. The fact is that in Britain there was a big debate. Who should we fight? Should we fight the Russians? Should we fight Hitler? Maybe Hitler's better because he'll invade the Soviet Union and so forth. And so when Stalin was trying to find an accommodation with the Western powers to actually make an alliance against Hitler's expansionism, completely rebuffed. And then this action of the Molotov-Ribbentrop agreement has a different character. It is a last ditch for the Soviet Union to buy some time against the coming invasion of Hitler. Well, this is how historians understand this, but it's not how any single rhetoric of politics understands this. It's an old event, but it's part of the lore that Russia will come to get us. After World War II, it's similar. Of course, the Soviet Union, and mostly Russia, but Soviet Union, incurred 27 million deaths fighting and defeating Hitler, and its armies swept across Eastern Europe to reach Berlin until the capitulation of Germany in May 1945. The way that the West tells the story is the Soviet Union occupied Eastern Europe in a cruel way, which is true, by the way. I know. I'm married to a wonderful woman from Eastern Europe who grew up in Soviet-dominated Eastern Europe. It was not a fun place to grow up. But what that story, that narrative, completely neglects is that the Soviet Union under Stalin, under Khrushchev, was trying to find a security arrangement that would not lead to what they feared of World War III, of a remilitarized Germany. And in 1945 in Potsdam, an agreement was reached to demilitarize Germany. And it is the United States and Britain which reneged on that and created the Federal Republic of Germany rather than a reunified, neutral, demilitarized Germany, which is what the Soviet Union was pushing for. Well, this is, it may sound like ancient history, but the interpretation of what the Cold War was all about matters a lot. And the point is that the Soviet Union had true security concerns. My God, they lost 27 million people to an invasion from Europe, and an invasion that occurred after Western Europe had shown disdain with the idea of having an alliance with the Soviet Union to protect against such an invasion. They wanted Germany demilitarized. So did many U.S. thinkers and leaders. George Kennan, the great statesman after World War II of the United States, the kind of dean of the school of U.S.-Soviet relations, urged all through the 1950s to neutralize Germany. A neutral, demilitarized Germany would end the Cold War. But we went the militaristic way. Well, I came into this story in 1989-90 in a personal level because I was involved with the Soviet leadership and then with the Russian leadership and the Ukrainian leadership. And I absolutely saw with my own eyes how insistent Gorbachev and Yeltsin were to make peace, to demilitarize, to end the Cold War. And we know, despite all of the lies and denial of the US and the European leaders, that there were firm commitments that NATO would not expand eastward when the Soviet Union disbanded the Warsaw Pact. In other words, every bit of history is read in a false and tendentious way to deny any security interests of Russia. Everything is meant to prove that Russia is the villain, the expansionist power, the only one that does things wrong, the pure evil, and so forth. And it's a false narrative. Now, you ask me, do the European leaders believe it? Of course, one doesn't know. I don't know Merz and I don't know Starmer. I do know Macron. He has said to me privately, yes, it's NATO expansion. That's what provoked the war. But publicly, he says the opposite. So I find him not trustworthy and not honest from my own interactions. I'm sorry to say it. It's a harsh thing. Maybe it's an obvious thing to people that, of course, politicians lie. But when you have been told face to face, yes, it's NATO enlargement, you're absolutely right, this is what provoked this, and then the foreign policy is completely the opposite, it's rather unnerving because this is the reason why this war continues. I know other leaders in Europe who also say one thing in public and another thing in private. I prefer not to name them, but I also have that experience. And then there are leaders in Europe who absolutely say it straight and have it right. And Viktor Orban is an example of that. And he's reviled in Brussels, and he's reviled in London and Paris and Berlin. But Viktor Orban has told the truth about Russia, Ukraine, and the West all along. He watched the whole thing. He knew the provocations. He knew the dangers of NATO expansion. He has told the truth, but he is completely rebuffed and isolated and charged with every thing imaginable by his European counterparts. So what is their deep understanding? I don't know if they have one. But I've seen the lying myself. Most importantly, I see the complete inaccuracy of what is said with major consequences. This isn't just a history quiz. This is a question of whether there will be peace or war in Europe.
You mentioned the security dilemma and Finland's winter war. Isn't Europe now repeating the same mistake, misreading defensive actions as threats and abandoning neutrality, which history shows, like in Finland's case, can actually lead to long-term peace?
This is exactly right, and the Finnish story is an important and fascinating one. Again, Stalin tried diplomatically to find an arrangement with Finland so that the Soviet Union could protect itself against a coming invasion from Hitler, which came, and which came also through Finland and through the Baltic states. So it wasn't crazy, it was imminent. And the Finns said no. They did not enable any kind of security arrangement for the Soviet Union. It's the same story as the rebuff of Stalin by Britain and by France. Of course, this is a painful period in Finnish history, but there's a reason for it. There's an explanation for this. And then when the war ends, Finland becomes neutral, It's called sometimes, Finlandization, meaning that it was subservient to the Soviet Union, but that's actually not the case. It was just neutral so that it would not be a threat militarily as an entry point for NATO or an entry point for a remilitarized Germany to threaten the Soviet Union or Russia once again. And Stubb is either a fool or profoundly, profoundly dishonest. I don't know him, and I don't know which it is. But if he told even a smidgen of the truth, he would be saying exactly the opposite of what he says every day. He would be explaining that since World War II, and whatever one says about the events from 1939 to 1945, and we've just discussed that, Finland had the best run imaginable as a neutral country, not only left alone, let me put it that way, but in addition, Finland became one of the most prosperous, richest countries in the world. And I co-edit every year a report called the World Happiness Report, where we report on survey data on life satisfaction. And Finland went to #1 in the world in happiness, self-reported happiness in an annual Gallup survey. And what Stubb should be saying, if he had a smidgen of insight or honesty, is that neutrality was the best deal imaginable for Finland. So I can't understand what this is about, actually. Again, I don't know whether he's a fool or a liar or simply a vassal of the U.S. military-industrial state or some combination of those. But his history, let's just say his potted history, it's absolutely the opposite of what he claims right now. He should be taking his friend aside, Vladimir Zelensky, put his arm around his shoulder and say, neutrality could be a great thing. Ukraine could reach #1 in world happiness. Believe me, it worked for us. Instead, he says completely the opposite of the actual Finnish history. Europe should have diplomacy. Diplomacy does not mean running to Washington and bending your knee. Diplomacy means actually engaging in Europe's interests vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis India, vis-a-vis the BRICS, vis-a-vis ASEAN, vis-a-vis the African Union, not under the skirt of the United States, but actual European diplomacy.
Jeffrey Sachs argues Europe is abandoning diplomacy and neutrality, blindly following the U.S. while ignoring NATO's role in provoking conflict. Leaders lie publicly despite knowing the truth. Finland's past shows neutrality brings peace, yet Europe repeats history's mistakes. Thanks for watching. Support the channel if you find this format valuable. More deep dives are coming soon. Until then, think for yourself and draw your own conclusions.